Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first Knox College Alumni Seminar. This morning's topic is Spiritual Resilience in Ministry, presented by Dr. Angela Schmidt. It's wonderful to see so many people present this morning, and that certainly speaks to the relevance and the importance of this subject. The seminar is part of a new series offered by Knox College in response to requests from alumni. And you can find out more information about upcoming seminars at the link you'll see appearing in the chat. My name is Duncan Jeffrey, and I'm president of the Knox Ewart Graduates Association, KEGA. I'm recently retired from ministry in Richmond Hill, and I will be your moderator for this event. We're glad you're here. We look forward to learning together. A few logistical items. The seminar is being recorded, and you'll receive access to the recording via email after the seminar. Following Dr. Schmidt's presentation, we'll have time for questions. Please use the specific Q&A section of the chat to type your questions. We wish to acknowledge the land on which Knox College operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And now, Dr. Angela Schmidt is a faculty member at Knox College and teaches in the area of spiritual care and psychotherapy. At Knox, Angela oversees the Master of Pastoral Studies program and is the Director of Experiential Learning, placing Master of Divinity and Master of Pastoral Studies students into congregational and clinical practicums. Angela came to Knox after 20 years in healthcare, directing spiritual care programs. Prior to that, she worked as a marriage and family therapist. Angela, like many of us, wears many hats, including pastor's wife and Oma to a grandson. She and her husband live in rural Ontario, already covered in a deep layer of snow. Angela, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. And I'm pleased to be here today. I want to start by telling you about the day I met Pedro. I met him at a bus stop in Vancouver in BC, early in the evening. And just 36 hours earlier, before this event, I was at home trying to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I was 23 years old, had just finished university, and had thought that I was going into a form of ministry. And doors had closed, and doors had closed, and doors had closed. And I was experiencing a deep sense of, where are you, God? And is it really that I am unworthy? Well, in those 36 hours earlier, it was suggested to me that I join the Pavilion of Promise in Vancouver, being hosted at the World Exposition. And so I was, within hours, packed on a plane, arriving in Vancouver at midnight, and not back to the dormitories at one of the local seminaries until about 2 or 3 in the morning. At 7 o'clock, we were all off on a bus for our training for the Pavilion of Promise and getting fitting. And this went on all day long. And so as it got toward dinner time, when we would be back at the seminary, I, of course, last to arrive, was last to get fitted. And when I exited the building doors, of which they lock behind you, and walked over to the pickup site, I realized that all were gone. The bus was gone, the people were gone, and here I was in a city that I'd never been in before, I had no money in my pockets. And remember, these are the days before cell phones. I'm 23 years old and thinking, how did I get into this situation? I have no idea where I'm going back to. I walked over to a bus stop and there was a group standing there. And as I stood there musing about how did I get myself into this situation and how am I going to get back to the residence, I stifled back tears. I thought about my exhaustion and just tiredness from the traveling, my hunger. And with that, it started to rain. Well, under the raindrops, I could hear sort of a quiet voice in the background. It was quiet and it gradually got louder. And at the beginning, it was a little bit annoying. And I could hear someone behind me saying the words, "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus." Well, my initial response was, oh my goodness, what on earth is there to be thankful for? And as I let those consistent words wash over me, I turned gradually to face the man behind me. His name was Pedro. He could see my distress, and he said, "Are you all right?" I told him briefly my situation, and he handed me a bus transfer and said, "This will get you on the bus and where you need to go." Said, "I'm going to the same place, me and my son." Well, that day in meeting Pedro, it began a friendship where he taught me about resilience in his life. He had been a former Catholic priest in Argentina, and his life had encountered much adversity and trauma. But over the course of that summer, he taught me about digging deep into oneself to find those places of resilience. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which is our agenda. We're going to do three main things. We're going to talk about the pandemic pastoring report, looking specifically at some relevant research results. Then we're going to unpack our understandings of resilience and hopefully expand them a little bit. And finally, we're going to talk about what does it mean to practice spiritual resilience. Now, you're going to need to do something. I need you to go and get a pen and paper, because as we do this seminar, you need to do a little work. And so the pen and paper are for when we stop and reflect. We're not going to be stopping and taking up those reflection times. We'll save that to the end. And so this is time for personal reflection. All right. So grab that piece of paper and we're going to get started. In September of this year, there was the publishing of the Pandemic Pastoring Report. This was a study. It's grown out of a much larger study that is following a group of graduates. It's a longitudinal study. It's following a group of ministry graduates from while they were in seminary to, throughout their career. It's now 10 years in. So as I said, it's a longitudinal study. It's 10 years in, and it will follow them for another 10 years. Now, this study, this Pandemic Pastoring Report, has grown out of that particular study in order to capture some of the experiences of those who work in ministry. The study specifically asked about the impact of the pandemic on them, both personally and professionally. And the results are really pointing to a new era of ministry. Now, the study's author is Dr. Eileen Campbell Reed, and she is a pastoral theologian, and this is the second part of her title I love. She is an academic and an entrepreneur. Those two pieces, those two titles don't always go together, and she is somebody who's embodying practical application of research. She is the visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And this report is something that everyone who is in ministry can take away some of the insights. So there are insights for congregations, for clergy, and for theological educators. for anyone who has a deep commitment to leading and caring for the church and its mission. Now, I can't go through all the results, so on the last slide we will come to is the reference, but quickly you can find it by Googling pandemicpastoring.org for a quick reference, and it's open access for you. But I do want to name a couple surprises. The study has some wonderful affirming surprises that were expressed by clergy, and namely how well clergy transitioned to online worship and learn new skills in technology and the provision of care for congregations when they couldn't be in person. It's the clergy named this as a surprise to them, and lay leaders acknowledged the tremendous ability to pivot that clergy embodied. Another wonderful surprise that's in the study is the tremendous affirmation that lay leaders have for clergy. There are messages and voices within this report that are very affirming for clergy that we don't always get an opportunity as ministers to hear. Now, the report itself is 6 questions, and you can read them there. You know, what about this season has challenged you and your church? What has brought you grief? What has surprised you? And key for this particular seminar is, how are you attending to your own self-care and your spiritual well-being? And then it goes on to the next 2 questions below. Now, I want to give you a quick peek at the recommendations, and then we'll get centered in on our focus here today. There were recommendations for and noting in terms of trends for what we're experiencing culturally, and certainly a level of grief and loss as people have moved on to that new normal. An acknowledgement of the anxiety that we are experiencing, from climate change issues to economic disparity to concerns of future pandemics, or the integration of multiple health hazards happening, coexisting together, and how we move forward as a society. The ministry trends that were identified is this: how do we cope with this enduring hybrid engagement and the cost that means to those who are in ministry, particularly for solo pastors, for those who do not have a technology person within their congregation? There were urgent questions about sustainability of ministry organizations that were on the brink prior to the pandemic, and in terms of everything from local congregations on up to denominations to theological schools. And what does this mean for going forward? And an enormous ministry trend has been increased place of chaplaincy. Most of us are familiar with chaplaincy in healthcare organizations, in education institutions, in schools, in prison, and in ministry. But there's been an increase in chaplaincy in airport chaplaincy, in movement chaplaincy, chaplains coming alongside of the great waves of Black Lives Matter, of other large social movements. Now, clergy trends are relevant to what we're speaking on today. And we're going to, actually, of all the trends, we're focusing in on one of them. It's the ministry resilience trend. There was huge expression of exhaustion and burnout, a renegotiation of jobs, and a particular beginning look at women leaving ministry, women being in a sandwich generation of taking care of children and attending to the needs of parents. And the cost is that women are having to leave ministry. A portion of women are having to leave ministry in order to attend to family needs. And what's interesting here is that we were seeing that trend with women and not with men. And third are the theological school trends, an increased enrollment, which is very interesting. These are generalized, within the population of this particular study. For Knox College in particular, our enrollment has been sustaining. We increased in the last few years, and then we've been sustaining. And the introduction of new spiritual care training programs, much like Knox introduced 6 years ago, with the Master of Pastoral Care, where we are training people for a profession in spiritual care, which may be in healthcare or community service, or in any of the places that we find spiritual care practitioners, or it could be in the area of counseling and psychotherapy. A further trend for theological schools has been faculty reconsidering how to prepare students for a new era of ministry. And in particular, how do we prepare them for the new area that we ourselves are unsure about? So for the purpose of today, we're focusing in on that second trend. Now, I want to introduce you to a second piece of research that I think is really relevant for today. This is a Canadian study that was done by Margaret Clark et al. And published in 2022. And although you may have participated in this research, I noticed that in the list of denominations, and there are many of participants, that Presbyterians were not among them. But there was a wide response from Anglicans and Catholics and United Church and Christian Missionary Alliance and other denominations. This research was looking into how clergy understand resilience. So rather than others talking about resilience, it was specific population is community clergy. There were 508 participants in the study. So it was a large group of Canadian clergy. And they were asked to name how they, not only how they understand resilience, but what are the strategies that promote wellness in them. Now, some of these things will not surprise you, but there might be a few pieces in it. And one of the first things that was spoken about was this idea of the things that we do before we are actively employed, engaged in a professional calling. And so they termed this as pre-service. This is the process of discernment, that sense of calling, and the processes that people go through for screening, the levels of screening. So whether it be at the presbytery level, guidance conference, those mentoring relationships that help one to unpack whether or not this is one's calling. I know in our own family with our children, my husband, who is a minister, often said, do not go into ministry unless you can do nothing but. And what he was really trying to say is that this is hard. It is a difficult life, and it is the best and most wonderful life if we're sure of that calling into it. But in order to be sustained and renewed within it, there are things that we need to do. And from the results of the study, there was a keen focus on this idea of theological meaning making. Taking time for theological reflection, making room when one is experiencing adversity or difficulty at a professional level or a personal level to apply our understandings from experience, from scripture, from theological writings, and wrestle together. Also, under spiritual understandings was this deep sense of relationship with God as a sustaining factor. Interestingly, the Canadian study also noted that what was supportive was seeking out a counselor or a spiritual director. And if I can harken back a moment to the pandemic study, back here, this pandemic report, one of the interesting factors that was noted in the differences between the lay leaders and the pastors was that pastors seek out in order, or they named as one of the most important factors, was having a counselor or a spiritual director. Lay leaders had that down about fourth or fifth or sixth. It was not the dominant. Actually, it was much, much lower for lay leaders. And so there was an interesting identification that what part of a spiritual practice is finding a confidential confessor for clergy. The number one for laity was time with other people, time with friends, time with family, time with peers. And this pandemic report teaches us that clergy has something to teach laity, and laity have something to teach clergy, because one of the most important sustaining factors for laity was engaging in other activities. And for clergy, it was much lower on the list. And so laity can teach clergy about engaging in a whole wide range of sustaining activities. But what is key for laity is they want to be able to go to church as part of their sustaining and to receive as part of worship, Bible study, engaging in small groups. And clergy, although they named those aspects as their work environment, they didn't name those things as the things that sustain them. Rather, they named their spiritual practices, as well as having that confidential confessor, the spiritual director or counselor, as key. So let me pop back again to this Canadian study that's echoing some of those same ideas. They thirdly found that clergy said they're most supported when they engage in professional development, conferences, that lifelong learning. And what they named as very important was skill development, the filling in the gaps that are not provided at seminary, where we can't do all, and yet realizing there are pieces that one needs. For example, learning how to understand the balance sheet. And then again, most important to our talk today is this idea of needing more wellness opportunities. Now, let me skip on. This is where your pen and paper comes together. Take a moment to reflect on where you experienced God's grace in the last 2 years. And then take a moment to write down, what is life-giving in your ministry right now? These two ideas point to where you are experiencing resilience in your life. So let's take a moment to define what resilience is. Resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, or threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family and relationship problems, serious health problems or workplace, or financial stressors. As much as resilience involves bouncing back from these difficult experiences, it can also involve profound personal growth. This idea of emotional resilience, of adapting well in the face of stress and adversity, implies that a person has coping skills to get through that adversity that allows them to adapt or pivot or change to new circumstances. Resilience does not mean that someone does not experience stress. It means they have the tools to cope and adapt. Resilience and coping are often used interchangeably, but I want to separate them out for a moment. Resilience is how the event is appraised, versus coping refers to the strategies we use in response to the stressful event. So let's hear that again. Resilience is the capacity to see and interpret. It's the internal process. And coping is a response. It's our behaviors. As much as I like this definition from the APA, what I found troubling is this idea of bouncing back. I don't think we bounce back. I think we rebuild. In the face of adversity and trauma, we begin to put the pieces back together. And this can be, for some of us, a long process. Another key word in this definition is the idea of process. Resilience is more than the ability to manage well. It's developmental. It means that we are continually growing or strengthening our resiliency muscle. Resiliency starts when we are young, whenever we encounter something new or experience discomfort, or even when we experience fear. Now, fear protects us from pain. And so that when we experience fear, we run, in other words, flight, or we hide, we freeze, or we turn and face that discomfort and we work it through. Emily Capito says that resilience is the counterweight to fear. As that muscle, that resiliency muscle is strengthened, when the next time of challenge comes, we are better prepared to recognize the resources that we have within us in order to process that difficult time. How do we recognize resilience? Well, resilience does not eliminate stress, and it doesn't erase life's difficulties, but it allows us to tackle or accept problems, to live through adversity and to move on. I'm hoping what you hear in that statement is hope, that resiliency is hope, that we will get through this time of difficulty. Resilience is interactional with our environment. And so it's worthy to note that a resilience is influenced by individual factors, by relationship factors, and by contextual factors. It is interactional in that we don't exist in a vacuum. And so all three of those things are impacting us at all times. In other words, our workplace can be a contributor to this stressor on top of whatever personal adversity we could be going through. And here's the critical piece that I'd like to just add in. There are ways that you can think and act that will help you to navigate during difficult times. This is what we're about to talk about next. So I'm going to say that last statement again. There are ways that we can think and act that can help us to navigate difficult times. But I want to do a quick shout out to those who work in full-time ministry. Developing good resilience strategies does not negate the need for strong and healthy human resource supports for those who are in ministry, and organizational policies that protect and enhance the work-life balance of professionals. That's that contextual piece. Let's turn to what you can control. Three strategies. Resilient people get that happens and that suffering is a part of life. The first line from Scott M. Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled, is a short declarative statement. It goes like this: life is difficult. Well, I remember I read that line for the first time. It was that same spring when I was 23 years old and just done university and trying to figure out what I do next. I just bought this book and sat down and opened it up and read that first line and closed the book. I was not prepared to embrace the fact that life is difficult. It had been difficult. the more difficulty, the message of the book is that more difficulty will still come. I wanted life to be a soothing balm. There was many years later, when my first husband and I and our 4 small children were dealing in it with a time of adversity and stress. It was filled with uncertainty and despair. My husband had lost his ministry position, which led to the loss of our housing immediately. It necessitated moving back in with my parents. And at the same time, our car became unresponsive on the garage floor operating table. This time of homelessness, joblessness, loss of income, loss of meaningful work, the elimination of our transportation, all while being responsible for the lives of 4 young children, all under age 7, and a marriage that was on the brink of collapse, forced me to return to Scott M. Peck's book. I had more to learn about resiliency, and I had to face that God was not going to protect me from experiencing the depth of loss and despair. Now, there is some good news, and that's that resiliency is a learnable skill. Number 2, resilient people are good at choosing where to put their attention. All of us are hardwired to notice the threats around us. And in times of adversity and stress, this ability to notice danger or what's wrong or what's threatening gets turned up. This is a survival skill, and it has served us well. But what tends to happen is we turn our attention to the negative emotions. We get focused on the negative emotions. And the more we try not to think about the negative emotions, the more they're there. It's much like if I say to you, take a moment to think about whatever you'd like. Go ahead. Anything. Just don't think about a white bear. Go ahead, think about anything. Just don't get an image of a white bear with its teeth baring in front of you. You get the point. The message of turning our attention or choosing where to put our attention is that you can actually choose to engage your brain to attend to something else. It's what Lucy Hone calls making an intentional, deliberate, ongoing effort to turn our attention to what is good in the world, to switch our attention to include what is good. In psychology, we call this benefit finding. In the American Army, they call it hunting the good stuff. When we practice gratitude, now take a moment. Name 3 good things that have happened to you in the last 24 hours. When we practice gratitude, and there is an abundance of research demonstrating that higher levels of gratitude are associated with higher levels of happiness and lower levels of depression. In fact, gratitude research is exploding in the field of mental health. Now, interesting, isn't it? For those of us who work in the realm of faith, we are gratitude coaches, but sometimes we need to get back onto the field and we need to practice our own gratitude skills. Number 3, what am I doing that is helping or hurting me? So we ask ourselves, and this is the self-awareness piece, what am I doing that is helping or hurting me? Is there a way that I'm thinking or acting that is helping or harming me? While we were going through that slough of despair, I was feeling utterly rejected by God. I was ruminating on, where did we go wrong? Where did I go wrong? I thought we were faithfully serving God. And it was then that I had a crucial conversation, or a pastor had a crucial conversation with me. He listened to my story of woe, of homelessness and carlessness and loss of employment and income. And he listened to that story, and then he gave me 3 words. Buck up Angela. Oh, that was hard to hear. He had earned the right to speak it. Now, he did couch it in lots of other kindnesses, but he had earned the right to say it, for his daughter had been killed the year before by a drunk driver. She had come home from university. She had found herself pregnant, and she, the daughter of a prominent minister in a small community, well, she had slipped out to get milk down the street and was killed by a drunk driver. This pastor had earned the right to say that to me. But what he was helping me to do was to recognize that I needed to move on from where I was focusing my thoughts and actions, and I need to put them into ways that were helping me instead of harming me. I needed to get my attention onto what was going well, that we did have 4 healthy children, that we did have a place to stay, that work would come eventually. And then with that, someone did offer us a home to stay in. Someone else offered us a car to drive, and eventually work came. Now, we strengthen our resilience muscle by increasing our awareness over things that we have control over. We set boundaries. We practice being more assertive. If those around you are placing unrealistic demands or asking too much of you, we practice the ability to say no. So for you, in your reflection, where in your life do you need to set a boundary? Or with whom do you need to set clear limits? We practice acceptance. Stress, pain, changes, they're all part of living. We need to acknowledge pain, knowing that pain will come and that we will survive it by looking after ourselves. Take a moment to reflect on something that is within your power to change. And what is something that is not? Another area where we strengthen that resiliency muscle is in our connections with others. Spending time with those we love, accepting their support, that's key. Speaking to them about the things that we find difficult. Take a moment to write down, with whom can you reflect? With whom can you connect honestly, deeply? And who else? The 4th one that's listed on there is critical. Can you allow yourself to be imperfect? Making mistakes is part of healthy living. Let me say that again. Making mistakes is part of healthy living. Keeping going and not being weighted down with discouragement when we get things wrong is crucial. All of us are fallible. And when we are less critical of ourselves, we are more able to extend grace to others. Finding balance in our life is critical. Can you name 3 things that you do that help you to maintain your balance between routine and work, or between routine, and the things that are pleasurable? So naming 3 things that help you to maintain your balance. I'm keeping an eye on the time here, and I'm realizing I have a whole list here, but I'm going to move on. Spiritual resilience. Studies have supported the idea that there is a complex and dynamic relationship between spirituality and resilience. Spiritual resilience, by Manning, states it's an aspect of spirituality. And spirituality provides a framework that guides individuals through the challenges of life. It facilitates the positive from the negative. In a study by Manning, the participants experienced spirituality as a pathway to resilience. In addition, the study found that spirituality and resilience were instrumentally linked to having and maintaining well-being. Now, my hope is that you're thinking, well, isn't that obvious? Is it not what we preach? Is it not what we feel as people for whom faith is important? And you're right. But the important variable here is that this research is an affirmation that supports our understanding and our experiences that spirituality and resiliency are intricately interrelated. Manning goes on to say that spirituality is the forgotten factor. It needs to be brought to the forefront in the promotion of successful living. Titus has defined spiritual resiliency as the capacity when faced with hardship and difficulty to cope actively using religious resources to resist the deconstruction of our spiritual competencies and to construct something positive in line with larger theological goals. Now, the coping part we've been talking about. The second one in there is this idea of resisting deformation in our spiritual competencies. I'm going to come to that in just a moment. And then the third one about constructing something positive. This is the meaning-making part of our life. When we construct something positive out of a time of difficulty, that in a way that it aligns with our belief system. Well, I worked for many years in healthcare, and it was not uncommon to spend time with people at the end of their life. They had lived with cancer. They were actively palliative, and they would share something like this. This year has been the best year of my life. I've lived fully. I have work concerns behind me. I have put all my focus on and energy on my children, on my grandchildren. I have done things this last year, which I hope to do some point in my life. This year has meant everything to me. It is possible to construct something positive when it is in line with those larger goals. And yet, it can happen that there is not an alignment between the two. And when that happens, we struggle with our spirituality and we may experience spiritual distress. So how is it that we build spiritual resilience? Well, we've been talking about strategies, and I just want to about from resiliency research, but I want to affirm it within the spiritual resilience research. And Sheloff named 4 key things among clergy and laity, and that is to set intentional boundaries to address intrusive demands. I thought that language was important because we can talk about boundaries, but we need to address the intrusive demands that can happen in our life. Secondly, we need to focus sufficiently on our own self-awareness and extend self-compassion. You can hear the alignment with the other research referred to a moment ago. And thirdly, prioritize spiritual practices. And I'm going to add to this and say expand spiritual practices. So there may be things, and it may have to do with your prayer life, your reading life, your connection in terms of small group or Bible study, but expanding our spiritual practices may include learning to walk a labyrinth as a prayer practice. Maybe engaging in Lectio Divina or other forms of practices that expand our experience. The fourth one listed here is engaging in peer groups. And I think what is important here is that we need to find our people outside of our faith community. If you'd like to walk, join a hiking group. If you've never painted for fun, go find a beginner painting class. If you played the clarinet in high school, find a group of adults who just like to get together and play. there needs to be ways to break down our isolation. And it means combating isolation actively. Clergy are not always good followers. We're trained to be leaders, and so we enter groups and assume a leadership role. We need to be good beginners, entering a new area, new practice, a new thing in our life, and learn from others. The second column on resisting deformation challenges us to not practice in silos, but rather form ministry teams. Find a way to benefit from the skills and knowledge of others. The one-on-one confessor is in there, and that what helps us to resist deformation is anchoring ourselves in our sense of calling with others. Lastly, is taking time for that theological meaning making, taking time to unpack those experiences, making room for reflection in our life. I'm going to skip over. I want to get to a space for questions. So I'm going to skip over this last reflection piece, and I'm going to close with a poem from Amanda Gorman. Call us. It's from her book, Call Us What We Carry. Every day we are learning how to love with essence, not ease, how to move with haste and not hate, how to leave this pain that is beyond us behind us. And just like any skill or any art, we cannot possess hope without practicing it. It is the fundamental craft we demand of ourselves. I have a slide that when we share this slide deck that I challenge you to go to. This is the Feed Your Mind Theologically slide. And I put in the links to 2 particular YouTubes that will help to anchor what I'm sharing in a much deeper theological context, and then a book about saying no that is written particularly to those who live in ministry. I put a slide on the references that I've used in here, and I just want to say a thank you to the Knox College Advancement Alumni Relations Office for sponsoring this webinar. So I'm coming to the end. I'm stopping sharing.
Hi, Angela. There was just so many things I said yes to, and I'm sure that the others who are listening and watching today were saying yes also. We've got ourselves into a jam where we really don't have too much time, about 5 minutes for questions and answers. So if we actually get into that briefly, I'm instructed by the technical resources people on Knox to say, you can continue to type your questions into the email, into the question and answer segment, and that Angela's responses will be transmitted with the finished, whatever it's going to be. it's like a mixed media thing. So I'm not even sure how do I see the questions and answers? Let's have a look. Okay, there's no open questions. So I guess people have got so much to think about and reflect upon that during the course of that, I think their questions will come up. I recognize that it's such a difficult time for my colleagues, and I hear the same stories, and you've heard them all. The euphoria that we beat COVID, that we got our sound systems working, that we got our church online, and then the despondency. We realize, well, people are still sitting in the kitchen in their jammies watching church, and we're not seeing them.
Yeah.
All of that and more, as you well know. So I thank you on behalf of the community for sharing that seminar on spiritual resilience, and it gave me an awful lot to think about, an awful lot to do and reflect upon. And I thank you for, I think, throwing a lifeline in what are very turbulent waters. And, many of us need to grab a hold of that. So I thank you, Angela. And all I'm seeing is appreciation on the question and answer chat. So I think we'll leave it at that. It's been a rich time, and we look forward to many more of these seminars for our alumni. So wishing you all a good rest of the day. Thank you, Angela, wherever you are, and enjoy that fresh air. It's part of coping. Okay.
That's great. And for anyone who's staying on, I'm going to take a look at the questions and the chat, and will remain. But for the rest of you who need to get on with your work and your day, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Angela.
I'm noticing that Brad Shoemaker has identified that Schleif, as an author, has noted the importance to engage in peer groups. We tried this, and out of 50 or so chaplains, only 4 to 6 would come every week. There's this, I think what Brad is noting is the hesitancy to engage in peer groups. That those of us who are in ministry, again, we're used to being leaders, and we don't always make good followers. And that is a skill that we have to develop, about coming alongside and letting others teach us about finding a safe place to be open and vulnerable. Thank you for your time today.